Wait, that can't be right. It says 4 goblins are hiding in the woods. They come out at elevation, behind cover, and they ambush the players at the start of the adventure? My brand new players won't know what to do. Maybe it's not so bad. I wonder what the DMG says. My budget for a moderate encounter is 75 XP per character. I'm running for 3 newbies, so that's 225 XP. 1 goblin's 50 XP multiplied by 4. This encounter costs 200 XP. That's basically moderate difficulty. I'm sure that's fine. What does moderate difficulty even mean? There is a slim chance 1 or more characters might die. Someone could die in the first encounter? A slim chance. Okay, this is a game after all. Things should be able to go wrong. What else does this section say on more challenging encounters? Changes in elevation. Terrain features that provide a change of elevation. Wait, that's in the encounter. It says a steep embankment and trees provide cover. I wonder. Defensive positions. Enemies in hard to reach locations or defensive positions. That's what the goblins are doing. They're in the trees. All 4 of them. Wait, and it says many creatures. The more creatures in an encounter, the higher the risk that a lucky streak on their part could deal more damage to the characters than you expect. What the hell is this adventure doing? It has got 3 of the highlighted pillars that make combat tougher. That's probably enough to bump into high difficulty. What does that say? A high difficulty encounter could be lethal for 1 or more characters. To survive it, the characters will need smart tactics, quick thinking, and maybe even a little luck. These guys are all new. They're gonna die. How do I fix that? Welcome to Mystic Arts, where I fondly remember the first time I TPK'd my players with some goblins and made fun of them afterwards. Listen, it's not my fault they developed a skill issue. They can get good whenever they want. My name is Daði. I'm a professional writer and director, and I've been DMing for 10 years. So how do you fix that scenario I just mentioned? Well, you skip one of the 3 challenges that make the encounter tougher. As I mentioned before, the 3 challenges are changes in elevation, defensive positions, and many creatures. You can make the encounter easier by making the goblins either not have defensive positions, not be above the PCs, or not be more than the PCs. Which ones do you choose to nerf? Well, that depends on the story of your encounter. Since this encounter is an ambush, it's about making the players be surprised, so you make there be fewer combatants. This is just good advice in general. When the monsters outnumber the heroes, you should probably double check your math and make sure it's all adding up, and that the monsters are somewhat weaker than the PCs. In our video on the 5th edition starter sets, I heaped praise onto the Lost Mines of Phandelver Adventure, and I do love that adventure. Like, a lot. But this encounter at the start is bonkers. It's gotten a reputation online for being bonkers, rightfully so. I've run this encounter 4 times. I haven't run the adventure 4 times, mind you, but the opening encounter, yeah, 4 times. And I can tell you, it has never been easy, not even close to easy. I have TPK'd a party with it. Even the parties that managed to succeed typically came out of the fight on the brink of death. The threat of a TPK was constantly hanging over them. In one hit, a goblin can do enough damage to immediately down a first level character. God forbid, a crit. The parties that survived the encounter usually had an experienced player who was helping the newbies make tactical decisions. Or in one case, the players outnumbered the goblins 2-1 because I ran for a huge table, and then it was a cakewalk. So yeah, 4 goblins ambush a group of level 1 newbies with elevation and cover. That can be a party killer. And it's from an official adventure. So lesson number 1, the game designers make mistakes. And those mistakes make it to print. Just because it's printed in a book with an official logo doesn't make it good or balanced, or even all that well thought out. I mean, this adventure was published 6 months before the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide was released, so I have a hard time faulting it too much. But then again, if your group bounced off of the hobby when their beautiful first characters were slaughtered by a bunch of goblins on top of a hill, well, you have full authority to be a little angry. Hell, you could get angry. They'd publish all these things separately at all. Who might have stopped you? There's always reasons to be mad.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore!
But I find positivity creates more positivity. So, let's roll up our sleeves and put on our critical thinking hats, look under the hood, and see what the problem is. Because this is the lesson, everybody. Are you paying attention? You cannot trust the modules. So how do we fix this problem? Well, I use the challenge rating system. It's not as bad as folks say. Challenge rating system, called CR, is on page 115 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's also available in the free rules on D&D Beyond, link in the description. Anyway, the CR rules outline how to do encounter math. It works like this. You look at a monster's stat block to find out how tough the monster is. A goblin costs 50 XP. Why do I phrase it like that? Because the next thing you look at is the big table in this section on how to work out the XP budget for an encounter. If you want a moderate difficulty encounter, you use the middle column, multiply the XP in the column by the number of players in your party for the total budget. You then subtract a monster's XP cost from the total until your budget is close to or at 0. Bam, that's an encounter. But loads of folks online don't like that system. They say it's useless. I think that's probably hyperbole. It's easy to oversimplify the flaws of any system, especially one meant to serve as a one-stop shop panacea for encounter design. Double, especially for games as wildly different as D&D can be. But that's the problem, isn't it? Your game, no matter what system you're using, doesn't know you, and it doesn't know how your group plays the game. It probably doesn't know that the paladin is unkillable, and that the wizard figured out some sort of clause that lets them do 60 damage with magic missile. It certainly doesn't know that you gave out a magic item that's just too powerful. On the other end of the spectrum, the game doesn't know that one of your players is confused by the concept of polyhedrons, and they frequently roll a d12 instead of a d20 and are subsequently extremely frustrated that they keep missing. How could the game know? It has to assume a baseline of some sort. So the CR system is the baseline. You need to work out where your players stand in relation to the baseline. And more than that, you need to work out where the monsters stand in relation to it. A bandit captain and an intellect devourer are both CR2, but in my experience, one is far likelier to kill a PC. Though there is a new monster manual coming out, who knows what it'll say. The only way to know which is to read the stat block. Or I guess run them both and see which one kills a PC, but I'd rather read the rules. If for no other reason than I'd like knowing when death is on the table. Which brings me to an important point. You, the dungeon master, are the author of your game. When you deploy an encounter, you have to stand by it. Your players will not accept the excuse that the book said it was okay, and they are right not to. You have to work out what an encounter is like, and if you're ready to deploy it. And then, once you have deployed it, you have to keep thinking about it. Keep game designing, keep thinking about how to improve the experience for your players. So when you see the encounter in a book, or a module, or on the internet, I suggest you check out what the CR math is like. Check if it adds up, especially if your party size is weird, like the example in the beginning with 3 players. Check that the monster math adds up and that any components that add to the difficulty are accounted for, such as elevation, enemy number, cover, difficulty of movement. Failing that, you could decide to nerf a monster in the middle of a combat, if you really think it's needed. Just ignore damage resistances, or multi-attack, or any kind of special reactions. Pretend it isn't there, and move on with the encounter. But there is something else to this idea too. To quote Matt Colville, encounter design doesn't stop just because you rolled initiative. The same goes for published adventures. Encounter design doesn't stop just because the encounter is in print. Some people may disagree with that statement, that's fine, but I believe it's good advice. But how do you keep that design process going? Well, you fiddle with the dials in the cockpit. What dials? The 3 dials, you see them right there, right here, in front of me. They are 1, troop numbers, 2, field promotions, and 3, sleight of hand. As a bonus, there's a switchboard just below the dials, we'll call your switchboard of dirty tricks. You flip switches in case of emergency. Now, we're about to break some illusion, so if you don't like seeing the man behind the curtain, then you might want to go watch our video on this living room setup behind me instead. If you're staunchly opposed to fiddling with numbers and you think once the encounter starts, players have made their bed, they might as well sleep in it, then I want you to know I've run games like that and I've had a lot of fun. And a lot of the time, even in my very story-focused games, I adopt that same attitude. Let the dice fall where they may. Sometimes I don't. It's a moment-to-moment decision for me. Essentially, I think knowing more tricks won't hurt anyone running the game. It'll only enrich the experience. Anyway, dial number 1. The troop numbers. This one is the easiest to adjust, and unlike, say, dial number 2, it can be adjusted at any time. And I think even the most combat is war type of players wouldn't balk at this one too much. If your players are doing too well and the encounter is becoming a cakewalk, turn the dial up and have reinforcements show up. If you're in a dungeon, they come through a door or down the corridor. If you're in a forest, they emerge from their hiding spots. If you're in an enemy camp, they come from one of the houses or tents. If you're in a city, they're summoned by the noise. The choice is yours. More troops can almost always show up. Be careful though, if you bump this dial more than once during a fight, players will assume it's a game mechanic, that reinforcements will continue to arrive until they kill the boss, until they loot the item, until they barricade the door, until they run away, whatever. They'll assume they're in a puzzle fight, or one with an objective. Unbeatable if they don't figure out how to stop the reinforcements. Alternatively, you can twist the dial down. The monsters decide to break and run. Now, fewer combatants remain. At a glance, that option might seem lame, but your players may suddenly care a lot about those retreating goblins. They'll panic about whether or not those monsters are fetching reinforcements, or preparing for a future ambush, or alerting Boss Tiefrippa before he can complete the ritual to the screaming mass. And now there's a new story to the fight. Stop the retreating units. Even if they decide to do that, it's not like the encounter stays the same difficulty, because the monsters are using their actions to dash or disengage. They're not using their actions to attack. And if the route works and the enemy runs away, you can tie it back into the narrative later, either by getting backup for a future fight, or preparing an ambush, or some other third options that tickles you. The choice is yours. Alternatively, there is a setting on this tile that people forget about. Your heroes might get reinforcements too. Maybe an NPC you've been meaning to introduce could hop in and save the day. Careful not to do that one too often. Ideally, save it for NPCs that are either here to stay for a bit, or ones that are morally dubious and invite more storytelling by showing up. Alternatively, a second party of monsters you knew was in the dungeon could join the skirmish to fight the first party of monsters. When the fight's over, a whole other storyline has started, and now the PCs worry about a whole new problem. What do they do with this new party of monsters? This way, the story keeps moving. You avoid the dreaded silence of a game without a game. When combat starts, you cut over to Suvi the Druid, and her guiding bolt immediately annihilates one of the standard monsters in the encounter. You think to yourself, oh god, this encounter won't even last until the barbarian's turn. And the last time that happened, Silas was pouty for a week. Drama queen. So you look over to dial number 2, field promotions. When the initiative gets to the turn of Mook number 3, you decide he's gotten a field promotion. And he is no longer Mook number 3. He's best described as this orc slightly bigger than the others, beefier. And your players understand the monsters have their own tank. So you double his hit points, give him 1 extra attack, and maybe an ability that lets him reduce incoming damage by 1d10 as a reaction. Maybe he's got resistance to radiant and necrotic damage. Whatever you think is appropriate for your level. Whatever you decided, you just weave it into future descriptions of Mook number 3. You render his features as you go along. When the big orc raises his warhammer, he snarls like a beast. His dead-looking eyes, however, don't move at all as he strikes. He's some kind of undead zombie orc lieutenant? Exciting! Ooh! Of course, field promotions don't have to be tanks. You can decide that one of the mooks is actually a spellcaster, an archer, a warlord who orders others around on his turn. It's up to you. You could turn the dial in the other direction too, a field demotion. On the mook's turn, you stand up, survey the battlefield, point at the mooks that nobody has interacted with and say, I forgot to mention, but these goblins are minions. It's their initiative now. And then you add them to the initiative order on their own turn, while flipping to the minion rules in Flea Mortals, or 4th edition. Or just ignore all that and decide they're the exact same as regular goblins, but with 1 hit point, which is usually how I do it. Then you run them as minions. You might then wonder, you lied to your players? At which point I'll say yes, all the time. There is no zombie orc, there are no goblins, there are no dungeons, and there are no dragons.
There is no tooth fairy, and there is no Queen of England.
I've been lying all night. So, just one more lie, chuck it into the pile. And if your players call you out on it, you shrug and say, who can say? And they'll infer you do whatever you can to make the game fun, and that it's in their best interest to stop peeking behind the DM screen. Maybe that's morally reprehensible, but I would argue it's no more morally reprehensible than telling kids about the tooth fairy. Let your players believe in their own tooth fairy. Speaking of lying, if your first 2 dials weren't a success, or you want to deploy something more subtle, even if it is more dishonest, there's dial number 3, Sleight of Hand. Who says that all goblins have 7 hit points? Like all of them? Even the itty bitty ones? The stat block is just listing the average, right? The rules say it's 2d6 hit points. Each individual goblin could have anywhere between 2 and 12 hit points. There used to be websites that rolled the hit points of all creatures in the encounter you set up. I love that. I'll go back to randomly determining hit points one day. Unless Kobold Fight Club is watching, then I'd ask if there's any chance of getting that feature added. Anyway, you could decide that the hit that dealt only 5 damage kills a particularly weak goblin, or a hit that does 10 damage doesn't kill a particularly beefy goblin. This kind of trickery can be pretty poorly received when done to something as iconic as goblins, but if you're running Slorbathor the Ogre Chief, then there's no telling exactly how many hit points Slorbathor has. You could just add them up a little, or down a little. I typically run for a table of 7 players, so when they face a named bad guy, like Slorbethor, I double their hit points. Otherwise, they're just gonna die before their turn starts. Let's say the named bad guy is an Orc War Chief. His name is Boss Teeth Ripper, and the Orc War Chief from the Monster Manual has 93 hit points. So when the PCs do 93 damage to Teeth Ripper, I say he's bloodied, and then I just track up to 93 again. This kind of sleight of hand works on the other way too. Once an encounter is turned into a slog, you can just decide all the enemies remaining are the weaker ones, and they seem to have fewer hit points. Maybe you make that explicit to the players. But you don't have to. Finally, there's your switchboard of dirty tricks. You can flip these little switches if you think you're in trouble. Pick one, flip it, and see what happens. One switch could be something like an explosive barrel. As a player moves past a corner on the map, describe them seeing a barrel of gunpowder or volatile magic crystal, with the implication being, use this to blow up the enemy really, really easily. Another switch might be an unsound tactical maneuver. An enemy could waste an action to dash into a more deadly position, or line up for some future plan or tactic, but the players are likely to spot it and kill said enemy quickly before they get a go. Now, that last action was pointless, but if they didn't kill it, you kind of have to follow through and make sure their next turn is even deadlier when they do whatever they were planning to do. Your players will learn eventually. You could also have the enemy change tactics and focus on a different character. Instead of downing a PC that was low on hit points, the goblins go for, say, the healer, which will feel scary, but the healer might have been in the back this whole time and they're at full hit points. So it's actually good news for the heroes and the action economy.
The economy is in shambles.
The healer can tank a hit that might have downed someone else. You can even introduce lair actions on turn 2 if you think it fits the encounter. You could decide an enemy has legendary resistances in the instant they're about to be hit with a spell that would otherwise trivialize the fight. It might even just be the one legendary resistance. You could decide to activate a part of the environment. A monster's action starts a chain reaction, like an earthquake or an eruption, or the floor breaking. That way, the monster spent an action on not hitting the heroes, but something interesting still happens as a result. I mean, let's be real. As cool as it is to see monsters doing fun stuff, it's usually not very tactical. Most of the time, the optimal use of any combatant's action is to attack, which isn't terribly fun. To counter this, one switch you might deploy is giving a monster a once per day ability that allows them to do an AoE, whether it does damage or heals allies. Good thing about all these switches is that they aren't constant. You can flip one, see how it affects the story, and then stop. Or flip it again, or try another one. It's just a toy box for you to play with. With all of these different methods affecting a combat encounter, use the ones that appeal to you and make sense to you in a given moment. Everyone's fairness radar is a little different. Things that seem fair to you might seem unfair to others. I don't think it's a linear spectrum, it's got holes in it. People who are normally very strict about letting the dice fall where they may might think dials and switches are okay, whereas someone who thinks fudging dice is alright might think that fiddling with a switchboard is messed up. To each their own. That's alright, there are a million ways to play. These are just some of the ideas for you to try and see if you like. You also don't have to be overly lenient. You could build and deploy seriously tough encounters without any futzing or sleight of hand. There's a great website on monster tactics I love looking at called themonstersknow.com. The premise being that the monsters know what they're doing. They are the monsters. It's inviting dungeon masters to think critically about the presented stat blocks and how to best use the monsters in a realistic and optimal manner. For instance, since kobolds have pack tactics, they have advantage when enemies are next to an ally of theirs. The optimal kobold tactic then is to let a tank, like the kobold dragon shield, run into melee. Meanwhile, the other kobolds make attacks with their slings from a distance, with advantage. That's a fun encounter I love to deploy. Combat design is one of those things that can be tackled in a million different ways, and system mastery is difficult. The best way to learn is to keep fiddling with things and build up the DM equivalent of muscle memory for what works and what doesn't. You know what I'm gonna say, right? There can be only one way to do that. Go run some games for your friends and see where you end up. See what you learn, and then run some more games and use what you learned. And on it goes. That's where we'll pick it up next time. Thanks so much for watching this video. Me and my girlfriend are having so much fun creating this channel with you folks, and we're getting to the point where we're starting to recognize commenters and their opinions, and we feel like we're starting to build up a little community. It's heartwarming. If you want to support us directly, you could consider becoming a channel member and getting access to our exclusive Discord server. We're both on there, along with players from my group, and we're happy to answer questions about the hobby, the channel, or whatever else you've got on your mind.
Like how sexy your characters are.
Yeah, if that's not possible or enticing enough, consider supporting us in other ways. You can like the video, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified when we release new videos. Until next time, keep studying the mystic arts.